operationalizing visual awareness, that's something we're going to have to do if we're going to be able to evaluate claims that there can be perception without awareness. Now, so far, we've discounted the idea that the 1898 experiments due to Sidis could provide us with evidence that you can perceive something of which you are perceptually unaware. What about the case of blindsight? Is that going to be discounted for the same reasons? Ian Phillips, a philosopher, has argued that it should be. He says, the claim that blindsight involves unconscious perception is largely based on a dissociation between responding in a biased task and performance in an unbiased forced choice task. So if you remember what I showed you a few moments ago, well, if you were following straight on, was a biased task where you had to tell me whether or not you could perceive the letter, and an unbiased task where you were given a forced choice and told, tell me what the letter is. Now, is Phillips right that this is essentially how we support the case that blindsight involves perception without awareness? Is he right about that? Well, if you remember, blindsight involves being clinically blind in a region of your visual field, so that if a stimulus, say a light source, is present in that region of your visual field, you would tell us that you don't see that thing at all. You'd claim to be completely unaware of it, even using a very strict standard of awareness. And we noticed that in the Weizkrantz et al. Study from 1995, one of the classic studies, although one of many hundreds of studies on blindsight, there is a measure of awareness. The subject has to respond according to whether or not she's aware. So this would be a biased task. That's to say that the subject herself has to identify a criterion by which when she can say yes and no. And an unbiased task, that's a forced choice task here, where the subject says that the thing is oriented horizontally or vertically. That's unbiased because it's not up to the subject here to choose a criterion. The subject always has to go with what she thinks is most probable. So on the face of it, it looks like Phillips is right. And so the conclusion that awareness makes no measurable difference to action is up for grabs. But is it? Look again more closely here. Look again more closely here. There are really two things going on. One way to read this is as follows. Here you have a high degree of awareness. As the luminance of the stimulus decreases, you have a lower degree of awareness. But nevertheless, the subject's accuracy remains constant across there. So although the squares here, the reports of awareness, that does represent a biased task, it doesn't really matter to us that there's a bias because we're not comparing the subject's reports of presence with the subject's reports of absence directly. We're saying that as the subject reports less and less awareness, there's no difference to performance. Second way of reading it, just look at the top two lines. So the diamonds there are cases of correct discrimination when aware of the stimulus, and the crosses are cases of correct discrimination when the subject reports being unaware of the stimulus. Now again, it doesn't really matter that there might be a bias there shifting around the reports of awareness or unawareness. The important thing for our purposes is that there's no significant difference in the scores in any of the conditions there. No significant difference in the scores in any of the conditions there. So yes, when the subject reports awareness, that is a biased task. The subject herself has to choose some criterion for deciding yes or no. And the experimenters here asked the subject to be very strict about this, to report awareness when there was any possibility at all that the subject felt she was aware of it. But that's not relevant to us. The subject chooses a criterion. Perhaps she does what she's asked to, perhaps she doesn't. But wherever that criterion lands, you can shift from very likely that she's aware, very unlikely that she's aware, and the discrimination performance is not affected. What this tells us, I think, is that Phillips is not quite right to say that our evidence for blindsight involving perception without awareness is largely based on dissociation between responding in a biased task and performance in an unbiased forced choice task. Phillips is right, of course, that there are some experiments like that, but the best research doesn't fall for that problem. One of the morals here is never trust a philosopher. Never trust a philosopher. Why is that? The philosophers will pick out bits of the empirical research that suit their theories. They will rarely give you a whole picture. So very often, if you read the philosopher's account of the scientific research, as in this case, Phillips is actually one of the most careful philosophers on scientific research, you're going to find that the philosopher will give you a bad impression of the scientific research. You can't understand science by reading a philosopher. You're right. I hear you saying that. Steve, you're a philosopher. Steve, you're a philosopher. You're absolutely right. I am a philosopher, so you should not trust me. You absolutely shouldn't trust me. Of course you shouldn't trust me. That's part of what I'm saying. Don't trust a philosopher to tell you about science. Always go and read the science for yourself. Don't trust me. Go and read the science for yourself. That's why I'm giving you citations. Every section, right under this section, there are the citations. It's all online. Go read the science. Check out. Am I right? Am I wrong? I'm a philosopher. You shouldn't trust me. Yeah? You shouldn't trust Phillips. You shouldn't trust anybody here. You also often shouldn't trust scientists, but especially philosophers are very untrustworthy when talking about science. So where are we here? We've seen that there is a problem with comparing an unbiased task, like a forced choice task, which letter is it, which orientation is it, with a biased task, like are you aware of it or not, where the subject brings her own criterion in answering that question. Those kind of comparisons are flawed, and so we shouldn't regard them as providing us with evidence for perception without awareness. Good. We've also seen that the flaw there doesn't affect the most careful, best evidence that we have that blindsight involves perception without awareness. So can we conclude that blindsight does provide evidence of perception without awareness? Good question. I think not. What we've argued is that there's an objection, and we've overcome that objection. But that doesn't show, of course, that the original claim is correct. Phillips says it's important to consider the possibility that blindsight in fact involves abnormal and degraded, but nonetheless conscious vision. Now, I think there's something right here and something wrong here. The thing that's right here is that the evidence as we have seen it does not rule out the possibility that there is abnormal and degraded but nonetheless conscious vision in blindsight. That's absolutely right. This is not a possibility which has been ruled out by any of the evidence that we have considered here. So that's good. That's good. That's absolutely right. On the other hand here, we have to recognise that what Phillips is offering us is a post hoc interpretation of a body of scientific evidence. I think there's quite a difference between being in this position, I come up with a theory, I make some predictions, and then I test the theory. If my predictions are confirmed, then I think I'm in quite a good position to say, looks like the theory is worth taking seriously. I don't know for sure that the theory is true, but I've got something to support it. I'm in quite a different position if I do what Phillips is doing here, which is to say, okay, here are these observations that support that theory, but I don't like that theory very much. Here's an alternative possibility that's consistent with all of those observations. Now, as a matter of logic, you will always be able to do that. Anytime someone has a theory and it's supported by 10 observations, 1,000 observations, you'll always be able to come up with an alternative explanation that's consistent with all of the observations but supports a different theory. This is a kind of fun thing to do, so I quite enjoy doing this. You could take the position of somebody who thinks that the Earth is not roughly spherical, right? So you could take the position of somebody who thinks that the Earth is essentially a two-dimensional surface, although perhaps a curved one. We're not flat earthers here, right? And you could argue, you know, all of these observations can be made consistent with that in one way or another, given some assumptions. So when we have a position like Phillips, we have to understand, well, why is it important to consider this possibility? Of course, there's going to be some kind of possibility, but why should we take this one seriously? And what Phillips does is he actually cites this work, Phillips 2016, and if you go there, you're right back into this argument about biased versus unbiased responses. That's essentially what Phillips 2016 gives us. So the thing I think's wrong here is this: we're not actually given a reason to think that it is important to consider this possibility. It's true that the evidence from blindsight doesn't conclusively show that we have perception without awareness, but then no scientific findings show anything conclusively. That's just normal. There are other possibilities. Phillips is right about that. But what we don't have yet is a good reason to consider those other possibilities. So very tentatively, I want to say that this yellow thing here is greener than it is red. We don't have conclusive evidence for perception without awareness, but on the face of it, the evidence provides us with good reason to conclude that there is perception without awareness. However, I recognise that many of you will want to argue for a different position here, so I'm going to leave that open. I'm not going to turn this entirely green. I'm going to leave that open, and I want the arguments here to flow. But more than that, I also want to see, can we make progress in thinking about better ways to operationalise perceptual awareness? Perhaps we can make progress here by shifting away from relying too much on these verbal reports altogether.